Hi, everyone. In this particular video, we're going to be talking about common myths associated with grammar. So the first is not to end a sentence with a preposition. In English, we do this all the time. So here's an example of a question. What was he talking about? About is a preposition. We still understand the sentence. There is nothing wrong with ending a sentence with a preposition. Um, it would sound a little bit weirder if we said, about what was he talking? There's much more of a formality in doing it in that traditional way, which is what we'd have to do to not end the sentence with the preposition. Number two is don't begin a sentence with a conjunction. Common conjunctions are things like and or but, which totally fine to begin a sentence with. Here is an example of a subordinating conjunction, and I am guessing that everyone at some point in time has heard the sentence because I said so. This is an example of beginning a sentence with a conjunction. Now, numbers 3 and 4 on our list are the idea that the ability to write or speak in what's called standard edited English shows effort and intelligence. In that if you're not able to perform standard edited English, then you are either lazy, or dumb. Both of these are inaccurate, right? Um, There are differences between writing and speaking. There are differences between various versions of English. None of them are a marker of intelligence. They all have to do with rhetorical situations and power. So please do not fall into the trap of thinking that the way that somebody speaks or the way that they write is a measure of the effort that they're putting in or the level of intelligence that they have. There are so many different things at work that this is not something that is accurate in either instance. Another common myth is never use the passive voice. Um, the passive voice is used all the time in some disciplines. The sciences is a really good illustration. They might say, for instance, the samples were collected. Okay. This is a passive construction. It's passive because the samples aren't doing anything. It's lab technicians, scientists, maybe graduate students or students. Somebody is actually doing the collecting of the samples, right? So it would be like the students collected the samples. That would be the active voice. Here in sciences, they use the passive voice because the person doing the acting is not important. What's important is what's happening and what the results are. And that's why using the passive construction allows the object of the sentence to enter the subject position and makes it that much more important. So it's completely fine to use the passive voice. You just want to make sure that you're using things in appropriate situations. So let us continue, shall we? So there is a common notion now that the singular they is wrong. So let's talk about this because I know there's so much happening around pronouns right now. I'm just going to try and talk to you about the way we've been using language for a very long time. So if we don't use a singular they, then we have to either write out she/he. Some people will abbreviate it she, he, or he or she. Now, when we're writing sentences or we're speaking, this gets very, very cumbersome. So here is where I'm going to give you an example and ask you to fill in the blank. My friend, so here's my sentence, found an ice cream shop blank like. Now, if you were saying this, how would you say it? I don't know about you, but I would say, right, they like. That's what I would put right here. and I'm just going to do it in all caps so that you can see and understand what we're talking about. This is an illustration of the singular they. Especially if I'm talking to somebody, I'm not saying my friend found an ice cream shop she/he liked, or she/he liked, or he or she liked. I'm just going to say my friend found an ice cream shop that they liked. One of the reasons why they, and we'll talk about they as gender neutral in just a second, but that it's become so prominent for that is because in terms of like American English, we have been using they as a singular pronoun when the gender is unknown for a very long time. So it's completely fine and acceptable and totally functions. They've even started introducing themselves as a singular form. So now let's talk about the idea that they is gender neutral. So one of the really interesting things is that they is really not gender neutral. A better way of talking about it is kind of gender non-specifying. But we use it for gender neutral purposes, right? So somebody who doesn't want to identify or doesn't identify with she or he, which, right, like being feminine or being masculine, for instance, they has come to take that place. Now, they is technically a subjective pronoun. It is a plural subjective pronoun, which means it fills the subject position in a sentence. But because historically we have used it to singular purposes, we can use it in this singular way, even though on its own, it's not gender neutral. It's kind of like gender all together, right? So it's like a group of all men or a group of all women, that sort of thing. We're using it to that purpose. If you see pronouns that are very different from he, she, they, that's really where there's an attempt to introduce new language as a way to like achieve actual gender neutrality. So they is used commonly for gender neutral purposes, not strictly speaking gender neutral, more gender non-specifying in terms of a pronoun. So another common myth is that two negatives in English make a positive. Now, check out these two examples. I wasn't unhappy, right? Um, that does not mean I was happy, right? It means that I was not unhappy. So it is important to be aware that there are kind of differences in degree, and that when we're talking about two negatives, it does not always equate to a positive. Here's another example. I don't want none. This does not mean give me some. This means I really don't want it. This is like emphatic, do not want. So good to be aware that the standard kind of mathematical rule does not apply when you're talking about language. Our last three I find to be quite interesting. So one of the common things that I've heard a lot is the idea that language was better in the past. So I am going to give you an example from Shakespeare that maybe will blow your mind. So here's an example of past language. It's going to start with thou, which, by the way, is a pronoun that we no longer use, but that did have a like solid function. So thou, whore son, which means exactly what you think it means. Z, which is British English for the letter Z. Thou, unnecessary letter. Okay. And this is a quotation from King Lear by Shakespeare. And it is Act 2, Scene 2, line 62. And the Earl of Kent is saying this to Oswald. So I give you this as an example of historical language. Oftentimes we have this like weird nostalgia, like language in the past did something that the present didn't. language in the past was spoken by people, it was unstable. It's one of the reasons why Shakespearean English is so hard to read. Here, what this example is basically saying, is that, right, you awful, right? Letter Z, right? You literally unnecessary or unneeded letter. So if we were kind of transcribing this into contemporary English, it would be something akin to saying like, you are so awful that like the letter Z, you are unnecessary. This is probably going to be pretty hard to like parse or to understand if you're just reading it. And it is a full on insult, right? So I say this and I give you this example because it is important to be aware that people in the past were still doing the types of things that we do with language in the present, right? Like insult rampant, whoreson, like actual slur. So just because it happened in like historical periods does not mean that it was any better or clearer than it is today. Another thing that is commonly said is not to split infinitives. Now, what an infinitive is the word to plus the base form of a verb. Okay, so here is an example of that. To love, right? To makes it the infinitive. Love is the base form of that verb. So to love, you have an infinitive. Now, here are some examples of splitting the infinitive. So to really love, right? She learned to really love them. Um, Totally functional sentences, I would wager that we would understand, but the really is splitting the infinitive, right? Because it's coming between the to and the base form of the verb love. Now, it would be much weirder if I said she learned to love really him, right? Um, or she learned really to love him. We split the infinitive all the time. Quite frankly, it sounds better. It's clearer. As we start doing some of these things, it actually makes language more confusing in some ways. So the last one that I want to talk about is the idea that ain't a word or isn't a word. Um, let's talk about the word. This really refers to a collection of letters with spaces before and after, right? So that way I know what the collections of letters are. The spaces are important. Ain't functions as a word, and I'm going to show you why. So if I were using a contraction with the word they, I would say they aren't, right? I'm assuming all of you totally cool aren't. You're like, yeah, it's a word. Great. All right, let's go to the next one. We would say he isn't, right? Or she isn't, or it isn't. I'm guessing you guys are like, isn't contraction, totally fine. So here is my example or my question for you. I, what? What contraction do we use there? Um, we can't say amn't, right? Which would be the abbreviation for am not. That doesn't exist. So the word ain't comes around as a result of that. Um, it gives us a contraction to be able to use with the singular I. Now, we could also say they ain't, he ain't, she ain't, it ain't, totally fine. But really we don't have a contraction that goes with the I. So I ain't is how how we start to get to that word. And if you're looking at ement, you can kind of get a sense of like how that happens, right? Because ament, you should try saying it ament, the MN really kind of hard to say. So the I helps with that. So these are 11 common myths associated with English. Don't let them fool you. We are going to be dispelling them throughout the semester as we talk about how to actually analyze grammar or language from a descriptivist approach.